Our next speaker is Michael Kaunitz. Michael is from Cloudflare, and he has a very interesting title called Senior SASE Specialist. For people not familiar with SASE, the term is for Secure Access and Service Edge. And Michael is a seasoned networking professional who took his technical background as a consumer and applied that to many different vendor roles in the internet space. And during his 17 years tenure at Akamai, he became enamored with the concept of zero trust. And he has spent the past 6 years working with customers and to help them on their journey towards zero trust and the adoption of the SASE model. And Michael will talk about zero trust. Just take the first step. How do you begin your zero trust journey?
Great. Thrilled to be here to talk about taking the first step on your zero trust journey. This is, the concepts of zero trust, while kind of seemingly pretty straightforward, can be somewhat daunting for a lot of organizations. And so we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about why that is, and maybe how to think about taking the journey in a much easier fashion. So first off, context is important for every discussion. And I think knowing why we are talking about zero trust is critical to understanding why it's become such a buzzword in the industry. Modern networking is really was built around the requirements of 20 years ago. Everything in that world, as you heard about from our friends at Microsoft, centered on the data center. Everything tied into that. Even if you were a remote worker, you connected back through your VPN into the corporate data center, either dial-up or some sort of IPsec tunneling, and all of your resources were there, and all of the security that controlled how you accessed your resources existed there. Fast forward to today, and while everything has changed in our world in terms of how we work, and that we are now, all of us, redefining work with the work from home, and I just call it work now, I don't even know if remote is the right word anymore. Applications have found their way outside of the data center. They're no longer sitting in that data center environment. We have cloud tenants in our own public clouds, AWS, Azure, GCP, and as well as SaaS applications of every color you can imagine. And the unfortunate thing for most users is that the corporate network environment hasn't changed to adapt to this new model. It still requires them on some sort of VPN connection to come back into the corporate environment where they are then given access to resources. And if it's on the internet, well, the traffic has to go back out onto the public internet in order to reach those external applications. And this is a model that's not great from an end user experience. It's not really great for a security experience, for security operations. If you run into real problems with this environment where you have so many different relationships now, and I think a mention was made in the previous presentation about how the variables are the bane of a security world. And it used to be we had many to one, many things. There are many users accessing one centralized location. Now we have this many to many to many model, many different types of users, not even just our internal, but business partners and contractors in many different locations for applications. And we have now an end-to-end problem, which creates even more variables and makes this a much more challenging environment to provide connectivity and security. And the problem with this model is, anybody who knows what a Rube Goldberg machine is that it works, and it works okay, but it doesn't work really well. And we could probably find some better ways, more effective ways, more reliable ways, better user experience to put a staple in that sheaf of papers than this kind of multi-step process here. So I like to think about bringing security to the users and making people be our new perimeter. And it dovetails really well in minutes. But think about the different vectors that your users have to leverage for their jobs. They have a vector for internal applications that sit inside the data center. private applications, if you will. You could also have those private applications migrate out of the data center into one of the public cloud architectures, or AWS, Azure, GCP. And that's, again, a private application. It just exists in a data center that's not within your control. But it's another vector you need to worry about for things your users communicate to. We also have to think about sanctioned SaaS applications. These are the ones that, the corporation says, yeah, I want you to use those as a part of the business. We own the licenses, go off and leverage those. And then, of course, the bane of most security organizations' existence is that whole dreaded public internet piece, where we have to worry about protecting our users from threats that exist out on the public internet, malware, phishing, other kinds of ransomware. We have to worry about users utilizing unsanctioned applications, especially in the South. We also have to think about even things like quality of life issues, like a user going and utilizing their own personal email and the impact that that could potentially have on the organization. And so if we build a perimeter around our end user, then we have the ability to control all these vectors for them very easily, regardless of where the user is. And that's the critical change that's occurring with the security models now, is we're not dependent on location. We're thinking about security based on who the user is. And so when we bring security to users, this is where the concepts of zero trust can really start to come into play, because we can build security around knowing who somebody is. And we'll talk about identity as that factors in a moment. But don't get confused by everything you see from all these vendors in the space who say they're zero trust product, they're zero trust product. There's no such thing as a zero trust product. It's a set of principles. I think there's a lot of services out there that honor the principles of zero trust. And it's important, as you try to consume some of these functions and do analysis and look through the community to figure out where to go, that you keep that in mind. And the same holds true when we start talking about secure access service edge, which is kind of a step beyond zero trust, according to Gartner, which brings not only the security component together, but also adds a networking piece into that puzzle. And who knows what comes next? I mean, we're in the infancy of all this, I think, which makes it such an interesting time. Now, maybe a really basic thing to answer here is, what is zero trust? And I ask this question when I do training for teams here at Cloudflare and my previous companies, and I always get these really long answers. And I've always I find that to be very curious, because I'm a man of few words, even though I use a lot of words. And I like to think about how I can make this most concise. And so I've distilled zero trust down to 4 words. And I'm curious to hear what the other panelists hear about this. But I'm going to go with trust nothing, examine everything. And the basic concept here is there is no implicit trust. I don't trust you based on one thing. I don't trust you because you're attached to my network. I don't trust you because you're using my corporate device. I don't trust based on any one factor about who you are in determining the access you get to resources. Examine everything. You can take this too far, but the conceptual framework, it says that I should look at all the signal I have when somebody's coming into my environment and asking to access some resources, and take every signal that I have available to me and utilize it as appropriate to help make the determination about whether or not this person should get access to this resource. So the critical thing here, of course, too, then, is this concept of least privilege. And this is more of a factor of implementation of zero trust, but we all know this from the security world, in that we don't want to give our users access to resources that are unnecessary for doing their job. It's a risk from a security perspective, and we've seen many high-profile breaches come as a result of lateral access in a network due to legacy VPN architectures that didn't prevent users from having access to resources that were not appropriate for their job. So this least privilege model says that we're only going to give you access to the things you need, and you can see nothing else. Not that you can see it and not log into it, you don't get to see anything else. And that's kind of the key factors here when we start to think about implementing zero trust. Now, from an implementation perspective, identity is a huge factor. Who I am based on my, credentials within here, Cloudflare, we use Okta, or, if you're Microsoft, you're using Azure, who you are within that directory service is a key factor to allowing policy to be determined about what you get access to. And then the other piece that gets sometimes overlooked here is the concept of segmentation. And I know the Microsoft folks mentioned this, but it's a critical piece here for zero trust, because it's important to understand the relationship between any entity in your network and another entity. And so segmentation occurs in a zero trust model, not just relative to a user accessing resources, but it can also occur inside the network itself, controlling how resources talk to each other. If you're in the retail space, for example, you have to deal with credit card information. PCI compliance is a factor, and many retail organizations segment their networks very heavily to ensure that only certain components of that environment are within scope for PCI assessments. So segmentation plays very much in the network, as well as for external entities, users accessing resources in the network. And many of the products that help support zero trust do dynamic segmentation to prevent users from seeing resources that are not appropriate for their jobs. Now, the big question, and I said I was going to answer this up front, is where do you begin? Well, if you read the NIST documentation and you read all the kind of classic writing about zero trust, they say you got to get your arms around everything in your environment. You have to understand all your users and types of users, what the devices they're going to use are. You need to understand all the network flows and the relationships between all of the servers and components within your environment. And then you have to look at all the servers and all the applications and all the data that you have out there and understand the interrelationship between all these, and then build a model that allows you to segment everything appropriately and build policy to allow the correct resources to talk to the other resources in your environment. And I'm here to tell you that if you go down this route, you're rapidly going to find yourself in analysis paralysis, because there's a huge amount of information here. And if you're any modern organization, especially if applications have left the building, then following the data and understanding what needs to talk to what and where is one of those efforts that's going to land you in a place where by the time you figure it all out, it will have changed again. And that's how quickly the world moves today. So beginning in your zero trust model has to give you a shortcut to starting this process without forcing you through the whole analysis phase, and has to give you an easy way to eat the elephant. So I've eaten a couple elephants in my day, and I think the best way is to start with a narrow scope. So one of the places you can narrow your scope in is into security risks. And as security professionals, that's a great place for us to start. Target those areas where you think you might have the greatest exposure, or maybe you've already analyzed, you had some sort of security assessment, or external auditor come in and then identified some areas of exposure or risk. Those are great places to start narrowing the scope down, start thinking about where you can implement zero trust as a starting point. That could be just protecting from the public debt, or how do I allow for personal use of BYOD, or maybe for personal use of applications like email, or maybe even how do I think about unsanctioned applications and the risks they pose for my end users and my organization. Isolation is another factor that's really helpful for narrowing the scope down. Think about different sets of users or groups or resource or locations that you can segment off from the business, or it could be a good test case. So it could be contractors accessing your cloud tenancy. It could be a third party that you have accessing one particular application. It could be an application you've deployed into your Azure environment that you want to give access to, or control the security around. Or even a group of users that you've have offshoring done. Maybe it's a customer service team with a unique set of requirements. But find that segmented group, but also be careful here, because for your initial foray, I do suggest staying away from doing anything that could have a high risk of impacting the business operations. So if you're using this as kind of pilot effort to understand how to implement zero trust functionality and how to take advantage of it for your organization, find a corner of the business where it's not going to provide a lot of risk for the business. Now, I like zero trust network access as a starting point for the zero trust model. For those of you who aren't familiar with what ZTNA is, it's a way of providing secure access to resources that sit physically behind a firewall or virtually are cut off from the public internet as a replacement for your traditional VPN architecture. And all these market-based, driven, carry risk, also controls build a least power to only the resources that are appropriate. And importantly, they help protect your network from lateral movement. And we know that that's one of those risk areas that that we see with traditional VPN approaches that don't prohibit that lateral movement in the network, that are wide open. And so this is a great place to start here because it does provide an enhanced level. Now, you can think about that ZTNA as a great starting point. It may not be to applications that sit in your own data center. It may be to the cloud. And I like the cloud as a starting point because in many organizations, since it's a nascent approach, it lacks the complexity that you have within your traditional network environment within the corporate data center. So some of the processes, some of the overhead, some of the maybe networking issues you might have to deal with going into your own data center may not exist when you go out to the cloud. And that may make it much easier to rapidly deploy technologies like ZTNA into that space. And since it's a constrained environment, you probably have a constrained audience and there's a much smaller scope for the effort. And that can make it much easier for you to wrap your arms around this and kind of have that pilot project and have success from that pilot project in a fairly short order. So you got a place to start. You found a constrained audience. You have you've decided you're going to use ZTNA. You're going to do it to the cloud. That's all well and good, but this is really a journey we have to consider here. When you start thinking about zero trust, the factors that come into play, as I talked about in my initial slides about all the vectors for your end users, really have to play into the platform that you choose to deploy onto. Because almost all the platforms in this space have a whole suite of capabilities that feeds more into maybe a SASE model, where you have all of your security services and your networking services all coming from a single platform. But even if you're just thinking about the security side, once you leverage one tool from a vendor, it's easier to leverage other ones from that same vendor. And so some things to think about as you look in the market and figure out who you want to work with. So simplicity is key. We're coming from a complicated networking environment, and we want to deploy something that's a new model here with zero trust. Find something that's easy to deploy, easy to use, easy to operate, so you're not adding to overhead within the organization. Make sure that the environment you're working with has the same kind of network resiliency and uptime and focus on availability and reliability that you have in your own network, because they're going to become an extension of your business. If you have 5 nines, they need to have 5 nines. It's an important factor when you start thinking about a cloud-based service. Also, I said this is a journey. Innovation over time matters in these platforms because where they are today is less important almost than where they're going to be a year and 2 years down the road as you continue your adoption of services on that platform and it expands to take a larger position within your technology stack. So a platform that can evolve quickly and flexibly with you that allows you to take additional pieces very easily is a key thing to consider as well. And lastly, I think about ease of transition. It should not be difficult for you to go from where you are today to take this first step. It should be low impact onto your business, and you should be able to leverage the things you've already spent money on from an ancillary products perspective. Things like your directory services and your your SIM environment, your orchestration, your endpoint management systems, endpoint protection, all of those things should be able to be leveraged in order to ease this transition. Now, I'm going to talk briefly about how we at Cloudflare approach this. Um, we have a unique environment. We came from, our origination was on the public website, and we went out and built a global network that's not just IPsec tunnels between POPs across the globe, but actually private networking, dark fiber, and 10,000 interconnects between our network and other networks. And we've done a really interesting thing on the technology stack here is that every server in every location in every one of our data centers runs every service. So for our customers, that means when you connect into the platform here, that you're connecting to a resource that's going to be close by because we have great reach, that it's going to perform well because it's connected to this global over a routing network where we can optimize performance in real time. And because we're so widely deployed, we can provide 100% availability guarantee for the platform. And since your user only talks to one node at a time, they will get the full stack of security services that you're leveraging from the platform in that one server. So that full integration there means fewer hops, fewer opportunities for performance impact for end user, and it also means a much easier and simpler deployment model for you as a customer. So we think about Cloudflare One as our zero trust networking as a service platform. So that's probably a mouthful too. But this platform is really designed to give you an easy integrated environment for accessing a whole suite of services. So that common network, all of these same services built into one environment, and the ability to connect into it in a variety of different ways. Now, when we talk about zero trust, I'm going to really focus in on the kind of the three big boxes on the left-hand side, because to me, zero trust is not just about our private applications that sit in the data center, but it's also about not trusting the things that a user interacts with out on the public internet, which is where a secure web gateway comes into play, and browser isolation, as well as having controls to ensure that we understand how the users are interacting with and managing our data within our cloud services, our SaaS applications through CASB. So this is a fully integrated environment here that provides that whole set of capabilities and that leverages the things you do today. So we can support any Active Directory or any SAML provider you may have, or multiple of those. You can tie in your identity service, your endpoint services to the platform. So you can do posture assessment both at user connection time, and importantly, as the Microsoft folks said, throughout the user session, posture gets reassessed, and you can tie in with third-party companies like CrowdStrike, and even with products like Intune for deployment, as well as the SIM environments like Splunk, log storage out on S3, and uniquely to our environment, the ability to actually directly connect into our network with your own private network connectivity. So that's one of the unique things that Cloudflare brings to the table here. Now, nobody would do zero trust if it didn't provide them with some benefits. And I think, if we look at the ROI here, it's pretty clear the customers I've been dealing with, and these numbers don't come from one customer, this comes from a bunch of different ones. But in the 7 years of working in this space, I've seen a lot of very similar results across customers. Is a reduction in the attack surface. Importantly, a reduction in the cost of breaches. And that has to do with the fact that in a zero trust model, you're limiting the scope of a blast radius of a potential breach. If you can get on the platform easily, there's a lot of benefit there. So that's where you get your benefit of onboarding. You're increasing the speed to onboard, and then of course, I look at operations as the last bastion of hope from a security perspective, and we're very shorthanded in most organizations. If we could drop the number of tickets and reduce the amount of effort on the IT and security operations team, well, that's a huge boon. It's hard to quantify that from a dollars perspective, but we all know we're overworked, and if we can reduce the amount of troubleshooting we need to do and focus on the beneficial efforts to improve the organization, that's a great thing. And of course, the one thing Cloudflare brings to the table, which we always have, which is better performance for all of your applications running over our network, regardless of whether they're internal or external applications, as well as full DDoS protection for anything that we deliver for you. So when it comes down to it, I think for SASE, for zero trust, you have to think about this as a journey and think about phasing it in. Don't try to eat the whole elephant and analyze everything in your environment and adopt all the componentry all at once. It's not really realistic. And I don't think that for most organizations that it's even that it could be even accurate if you go and try to do it, because the analysis that has to be done at each step along the way has to be done at the point in time of implementation for each of the components. And if you get too far ahead of yourself, you might find that by the time you get ready to implement something, say segmentation in your data center, that you've already the environment has already changed and you need to do the analysis again. So I implore you, I've been saying this to people for a long time, like now is the time to start this. Find a way to get this into your environment. The threat landscape is not going to be your friend if you continue to wait. We know that this is a big factor here. These are all cloud-based services, and you need to gain more experience working with the cloud-native services. You have it with other SaaS applications, but the flexibility most of these platforms can provide for you is going to be a real boon to your organization. And don't be afraid to get started in a small way and make some mistakes up front. Gaining that experience will really help you as you move toward the future and you avoid complexity in the future. So don't worry about taking the entire journey. Just take one step.